Something happened inside the royal family that almost nobody expected. And what makes it so remarkable isn't simply the outcome. It's the reason the outcome became possible in the first place. For years, King Charles III reportedly believed that once he became monarch, the authority to reshape key parts of the royal institution rested entirely with him. That meant titles, royal residences, long-standing arrangements, and the traditions surrounding them could all be reviewed if he believed change was necessary. It sounded like the natural power of a king. But on March 25, 2026, that belief collided with something far stronger than expectation. It collided with signed records, carefully preserved agreements, and decisions made years before the crown ever passed to him. What turned this into such an extraordinary story is that Prince Edward didn't rely on influence, public opinion, or palace politics. Instead, he uncovered the legal boundaries of royal authority itself, proving that even a reigning monarch cannot simply undo promises that were deliberately secured long before his reign began. So this is where the story truly begins. Long before the public ever heard about disagreements over royal property or private gifts, Queen Elizabeth II was already making decisions that she intended to outlast her reign. During the final years of her life, she had watched the monarchy face constant pressure from changing expectations, financial scrutiny, and growing debates about what the institution should look like in the future. Those changes convinced her that certain promises needed to be settled while she was still alive. She wanted some matters placed beyond uncertainty, and among the most important was the future of Prince Edward. For decades, the title of Duke of Edinburgh had been inseparable from Prince Philip. It represented far more than rank. It reflected a lifetime of service, responsibility, and commitment to the crown. Elizabeth believed that legacy should continue through the son who had quietly supported the monarchy without attracting scandal or unnecessary attention. That decision had been discussed within the family long before it became official, and when King Charles III formally granted Edward the title in 2023, many assumed the Queen's wishes had been fully carried out. But the title itself was only part of the picture. Attached to it was Bagshot Park, the historic residence associated with the Dukedom of Edinburgh. To most people, it looked like another royal estate hidden among the grounds of Windsor Great Park. In reality, it carried enormous symbolic importance. It represented the physical center of Edward's new role, and according to the documents prepared during Elizabeth's final years, it was intended to remain connected to the title itself. Those records were not casual notes. They reflected careful planning and were supported by witnesses who understood why the arrangement mattered. After Elizabeth's death, however, a different approach appeared to take shape inside the palace. The new reign brought fresh conversations about reducing costs, modernizing the institution, and reviewing long-standing arrangements that had existed for decades. As those discussions expanded, attention reportedly turned toward royal residences, financial agreements, and properties connected to working members of the family. Bagshot Park gradually became part of those wider reviews. That immediately placed Prince Edward in an uncomfortable position. He had waited much of his life to inherit the role his father had made famous. Yet only a short time after finally receiving it, questions were emerging about the residence most closely tied to that position. From Edward's perspective, separating the estate from the title would fundamentally change what had been passed to him. A dukedom without its traditional seat would lose much of the practical foundation that had supported it for generations. What made the situation even more significant was the history of Bagshot Park itself. When Edward accepted responsibility for the estate years earlier, it was far from the impressive royal residence visitors see today. Large sections required extensive renovation, maintenance costs were substantial, and the property demanded years of investment before it could function as a suitable home again. Rather than walking away from those responsibilities, Edward committed himself to restoring it. Significant sums of private money were invested into repairs and modernization, while long-term agreements established the financial terms under which he would occupy the estate. Those commitments changed everything. Edward was no longer simply living in a royal residence assigned for convenience. He had accepted legal obligations, invested personal resources, and entered agreements that reflected years of planning. As time passed, those investments dramatically increased both the value and the stability of the property. By the middle of the decade, Bagshot Park had become far more than a residence. It had become one of the strongest foundations supporting Edward's position within the royal family. That history would soon prove far more important than anyone outside palace walls realized. Because once questions about the estate began to surface, every document, every agreement, and every decision made years earlier suddenly became the center of a much larger confrontation. What had started as quiet administrative reviews was beginning to evolve into something far more serious, and Prince Edward understood that the real battle had only just begun. What strengthened Prince Edward's position wasn't simply that he believed the arrangements were fair. It was that years of paperwork appeared to support every major decision that had been made before the crown changed hands. By the time concerns over Bagshot Park began attracting serious attention, the discussion had already moved beyond family expectations. It was becoming a matter of legal interpretation, documented agreements, and the limits of royal authority. At the center of that debate was the history of the estate itself. Bagshot Park had not remained in royal hands because it was effortless to maintain. When Edward first became associated with the property, it required extensive restoration after years of decline. The buildings demanded structural work, modern upgrades, and continuous investment before they could serve as an appropriate residence. Taking responsibility for the estate meant accepting obligations that many people outside the monarchy rarely considered. It wasn't simply a prestigious address. It was an expensive commitment. Edward chose to make that commitment. Instead of relying entirely on public funding, he invested significant personal resources into restoring the property. Over time, improvements transformed Bagshot Park into a fully functioning royal residence once again. Financial records connected to those renovations became part of a larger history showing that the estate had been preserved through years of planning rather than short-term decisions. Every repair, lease adjustment, and contractual agreement added another layer to Edward's position. That became increasingly important as conversations inside the palace reportedly shifted toward reviewing long-standing royal arrangements. Modernization had become one of the defining themes of King Charles III's reign. Supporters argued that reducing costs and streamlining the monarchy reflected changing public expectations. But critics questioned where those reviews should end. If modernization meant reopening agreements personally approved by Queen Elizabeth II, some believed it could create uncertainty about decisions that had previously been regarded as settled. Bagshot Park soon found itself at the center of those concerns. Reports suggested that officials were examining properties connected with working members of the royal family, evaluating financial arrangements and long-term occupancy. Although such reviews could be presented as administrative exercises, their practical consequences carried enormous significance. If a historic residence connected to a hereditary title could be reconsidered, then other long-standing arrangements might also become vulnerable. Edward reportedly understood exactly what that possibility meant. For years he had quietly built a detailed record demonstrating not only financial investment but also responsible stewardship of the estate. Lease agreements, restoration records, maintenance history, and supporting documentation combined to create a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Rather than depending on informal family understandings, his position rested upon documented commitments accumulated over decades. But while property issues continued developing behind closed doors, another dispute was beginning to emerge. This one involved Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. According to the narrative surrounding the events, questions began arising over pieces of jewelry long associated with Sophie, particularly the tiara created for her wedding. What appeared on the surface to be a routine administrative review quickly became far more sensitive because the jewelry represented something much deeper than ceremonial decoration. For Sophie, it formed part of her personal history within the royal family, closely connected to Queen Elizabeth II and to milestones that marked the beginning of her royal life. That emotional connection transformed the discussion. If personal gifts could later be reconsidered as institutional property, the implications would extend well beyond a single item. Similar questions could eventually touch numerous gifts exchanged throughout Elizabeth's long reign. What first appeared to concern one tiara suddenly raised broader issues about ownership, precedent, and the distinction between private possessions and crown assets. Edward's legal advisors reportedly recognized those wider consequences almost immediately. Rather than viewing the review as an isolated administrative matter, they treated it as another challenge requiring documentary evidence. Deeds, gift records, historical correspondence, and supporting files reportedly became central to their response. Their strategy reflected the same approach already visible in the dispute over Bagshot Park: answer every question with written documentation rather than emotion or public confrontation. As those files continued to grow, the atmosphere inside palace circles reportedly became increasingly tense. The disagreements were no longer confined to discussions about one residence or one piece of jewelry. They were gradually evolving into something much larger, raising difficult questions about promises made by one monarch and the authority exercised by the next. And with every new document added to the growing legal file, the eventual confrontation appeared to move one step closer. By the time those documents had been assembled, the dispute had moved well beyond legal paperwork. What had started as questions surrounding property and personal gifts was beginning to reshape relationships inside the royal family itself. The arguments were no longer confined to advisors, solicitors, or administrative offices. They were reaching the highest levels of the monarchy, where every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate disagreement. That was the moment Princess Anne became impossible to ignore. Anne had spent her entire public life building a reputation for discipline, consistency, and unwavering loyalty to duty. She rarely entered public disagreements, and when she remained silent, people understood that silence carried its own message. But according to the accounts surrounding these events, this situation demanded something different. From her perspective, the issue was no longer simply about Prince Edward. It concerned the authority of Queen Elizabeth II's final decisions and whether those decisions would continue to command respect after her passing. That distinction mattered enormously. If signed commitments made by one monarch could later be questioned simply because a new reign had begun, then every carefully documented arrangement risked becoming uncertain. And reportedly viewed that possibility as a threat extending far beyond one estate or one family member. It touched the credibility of the institution itself. Before any direct conversations took place, Anne is said to have familiarized herself with the history surrounding Bagshot Park. She reportedly examined the long-term lease, the financial commitments Edward had accepted, and the years of restoration that transformed the estate into a functioning royal residence. Those records painted a clear picture. Edward had not simply inherited a comfortable home. He had invested time, resources, and personal responsibility into preserving it. That history shaped her position. To Anne, agreements supported by documented obligations deserved to be honored. The Crown had accepted those arrangements over many years, and attempting to reopen them after substantial investment had already been made raised questions that extended beyond family preference. It became an issue of consistency and institutional reliability. But property was only one part of the growing dispute. The questions surrounding Sophie's wedding tiara carried a different kind of significance. Anne understood that certain royal possessions were valuable not only because of their material worth but because of the memories attached to them. A wedding gift from Queen Elizabeth II represented a deeply personal connection that could not easily be separated from the legal documents supporting it. To reduce that relationship to a technical classification risked overlooking the human meaning behind the object itself. She had witnessed decades of royal history unfold from inside the institution. She understood how disagreements over symbolism could sometimes become even more damaging than disputes over money. Once confidence inside the family began to erode, repairing those relationships became far more difficult than resolving legal questions. As discussions intensified, Anne is said to have made her concerns known directly. Her reported argument focused on continuity. Every monarch inherited not only authority but also responsibility for preserving commitments made before their reign. Respecting those commitments reinforced confidence in the crown itself. Undermining them, she believed, could weaken that confidence in ways that extended well into the future. Those conversations reportedly left King Charles III facing an increasingly difficult position. On one side stood efforts to modernize aspects of the monarchy and reassess long-standing arrangements. On the other stood documented decisions approved by Queen Elizabeth II and supported by years of existing agreements. Neither option offered an easy solution. Every step risked creating fresh controversy. Meanwhile, Prince Edward remained remarkably restrained. Rather than engaging publicly, he reportedly continued relying on legal documentation, historical records, and formal procedures. That approach became one of the defining features of the entire dispute. While speculation circulated outside palace walls, his response consistently emphasized evidence instead of confrontation. Every agreement, every signed document, and every historical record reinforced the same message: the strongest argument was the one supported by paperwork. As more advisors reviewed the growing file, one conclusion reportedly became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The dispute was no longer being driven by emotion alone. It had evolved into a detailed examination of decades of decisions, financial commitments, and documented royal promises. And with each new review, it became increasingly apparent that the final outcome might depend less on authority than on the written record left behind. As more legal reviews reportedly reached their conclusion, the direction of the dispute began to change. For weeks, the conversation had centered on what might happen next. Now attention shifted to what the available documentation actually supported. According to the narrative surrounding these events, the collection of leases, gift records, financial agreements, and historical correspondence formed a remarkably consistent picture. Instead of revealing uncertainty, they appeared to reinforce decisions that had already been made years before. That realization carried significant consequences. The question was no longer whether Prince Edward believed he had a strong position. It was whether those examining the evidence could reasonably reach a different conclusion. One document supported another. Financial records aligned with lease agreements. Historical decisions matched later confirmations. Rather than standing on a single piece of evidence, the case reportedly rested on decades of connected documentation. For King Charles III, that created an increasingly difficult situation. As monarch, he had inherited responsibility for guiding the institution through a period of change. Modernization remained an important objective, but modernization also depended upon public confidence. If reforms appeared to disregard carefully documented commitments approved by Queen Elizabeth II, critics could argue that stability itself was being weakened. That was a risk no monarch could easily ignore. Yet the pressure surrounding the palace reportedly did not disappear. Questions continued circulating among staff, advisors, and commentators about how the dispute would ultimately end. Different opinions emerged behind closed doors. Some believed administrative reviews should continue regardless of tradition. Others reportedly argued that reopening settled matters threatened to create unnecessary division within the royal family. As differing viewpoints spread, maintaining complete unity became increasingly difficult. The atmosphere reportedly reflected that uncertainty. People who had worked with various royal households for years found themselves interpreting the situation in different ways. Conversations that once remained entirely private reportedly became harder to contain. Speculation expanded beyond palace walls, and every new report fueled additional debate about the future direction of the monarchy. What had begun as a disagreement over specific arrangements was gradually becoming a broader discussion about continuity, authority, and trust. Throughout that period, Prince Edward's approach remained notably consistent. He reportedly avoided public confrontation, choosing instead to rely upon formal procedures and documented evidence. Rather than responding through interviews or public statements, he allowed legal representatives and historical records to speak on his behalf. That strategy contrasted sharply with the growing speculation surrounding the dispute. While others debated motives, Edward's position continued to focus on written agreements that had accumulated over many years. Eventually, according to the account, the matter reached its decisive stage. A formal communication reportedly confirmed that Sophie would retain exclusive private control of the wedding tiara that had become central to the controversy. Around the same time, the review concerning Bagshot Park also came to an end. The outcome reflected recognition of the existing arrangements rather than any effort to replace them. From that point forward, the title, the residence, and the personal gift remained exactly where previous decisions had placed them. But the conclusion did not erase everything that had happened. Even after the immediate questions were settled, the events reportedly left a lasting impression inside the royal family. Disagreements over authority, interpretation, and institutional responsibility had exposed tensions that could not simply disappear with a single decision. Relationships shaped over decades had now experienced a period of extraordinary strain. Perhaps the most enduring consequence involved the broader principle established by the dispute. According to this narrative, the outcome demonstrated that written commitments, legal agreements, and carefully documented decisions could carry weight regardless of changing circumstances. The discussion had begun with assumptions about what a reigning monarch might be able to alter. It ended with renewed attention on the importance of records created long before the dispute itself ever emerged. In that sense, the story became about far more than one estate, one title, or one piece of jewelry. It became a reminder that within an institution built on centuries of tradition, history often speaks through documents as much as through ceremony. And when those documents survive careful examination, they can shape the future just as powerfully as the people who originally signed them. But even after everything was settled on paper, the story didn't really end. It simply entered a different chapter. Some disagreements can be resolved with documents. Others leave behind consequences that no legal decision can erase. According to this account, the relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward would never return to what it once was. Publicly, the royal family would continue presenting the same united image the world has always expected. Official appearances would continue. Ceremonies would move forward. Photographs would suggest harmony. But behind those carefully managed moments, the memory of what had happened would remain impossible to ignore. The larger impact reached beyond two brothers. It raised difficult questions about continuity inside the monarchy itself. Queen Elizabeth II spent decades building a system based on trust, tradition, and carefully recorded decisions. This dispute became a reminder that those decisions could still shape events long after the people who made them were gone. For those closest to the institution, that lesson may prove even more important than the legal outcome itself. For Prince Edward and Sophie, the reported outcome represented more than retaining a residence or preserving a personal gift. It reinforced the belief that commitments supported by evidence could withstand extraordinary pressure. They did not rely on public campaigns or dramatic statements. Instead, they relied on preparation, patience, and records that had been assembled over many years. As for King Charles III, history will judge far more than the decisions themselves. It will also judge how those decisions affected the unity of the family he now leads. Because authority may define a reign, but trust determines how that authority is remembered. And when the ceremonies are over, the headlines fade, and the official records are placed into the archives, that may be the legacy people continue discussing for years to come.